Hello, and welcome to the VECTRA podcast. Today, we're joined by Nina Mehta, who is a knowledgeable ESG professional in the textile industry. She has worked hands-on helping companies navigate reporting challenges, strengthen due diligence, and build resilient supply chains. Today, we're going to discuss where companies struggle the most when it comes to reporting. And more importantly, how can companies turn reporting from a regulatory burden into a competitive advantage? Nina will also share some tips that can help you navigate any reporting challenges you may have. So let's dive right in.
Yes, Octavia, that was a great introduction. And yes, let's dive in. But before we dive in, I want to talk a little bit about the background. Why this topic reporting? I'd like to share some insights. The textile industry in India is export-driven industry. In order to maintain its edge in a growing competitive global environment with uncertainties, communicating and reporting on companies' due diligence can help the industry to build its USP and remain an important player in the global scenario. The United Nations Guiding Principle 21 emphasizes that business enterprises whose operations pose risks of severe human rights impacts should report formally on how they address and manage their risks. A little bit more about this is that the principle states the need to publicly communicate the action businesses have taken or intend to take. There should be transparency and accountability for individuals or groups who may have been affected by a business's process. Showing involves communicating, providing a measure how they address the human right impacts. They should be prepared to communicate this externally, particularly when concerns are raised by, on behalf of affected stakeholders. Today, showing is knowing. This all is also supported by the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which requires companies to report on a broad range of sustainability topics and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards.
So, ESG reporting has become a big focus in the textile industry. Why do you think it's such a critical part of responsible sourcing and compliance today?
Good question, Octavia. Reporting is a critical aspect of responsible sourcing since clear reporting helps in continuous improvement and business and translates into good performance, which improves the ESG ratings of the company. Sustainability is a collaborative effort by the buyer and the seller. Reporting encourages transparency and symbolizes a business's commitment to accountability and openness. It also builds customer trust and confidence.
So, transparency being a key word there, as
Yes.
well as indeed, it's important to get the customer's trust for sure. When you work with companies on their reporting, what are some of the biggest challenges they face? Are there recurring issues that come up time and again?
Yes, there are issues that come up time and again. I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on this question. Now, many businesses do not have a dedicated team in place for sustainability and reporting. This increases the workload of the existing staff who may not be sufficiently skilled or trained to fulfill this responsibility. Also, I have seen that small and medium-sized businesses, what you call SMEs, lack the tools, knowledge, and framework that are needed to report and communicate externally, particularly where concerns are raised by or on behalf of affected stakeholders. SMEs, which are a major part of the business, do not have access to training or resources that educate them on ethical labor practices and human rights risks. There is a need for companies to take additional training on ESG metrics for all employees. And finally, I'd like to talk about sometimes lots of businesses, due to lack the transparency with customers, is also one of the big challenges.
Okay, so training on ESG metrics being very important, so companies really understand also what they're reporting on,
Yes.
and what it's all about. One of the biggest hurdles in ESG reporting seems to be data collection. Why is it so difficult for textile companies to gather reliable data? And how can they overcome these challenges?
This question is time and time again, which has come up with many people. Of course, they struggle with data collection. There are a couple of reasons on this, which comes to my mind over here. Now, let's talk about non-commitment of businesses towards their supply chain, no buy-in from the top management or the owners. Another reason can be lack of common sustainable vision and consequently collaboration and cooperation between departments and functions within the company. There is also that risks are often not correctly identified within the company or the supply chain. Lack of concrete data, which is clear, measurable, and transparent. Also, I can think of a few more reasons would be lack of accountability towards reporting responsibilities of the appointed personnel in the business. And finally, I'd like to talk about developing of qualitative and quantitative indicators. Here, what do I mean by qualitative? Qualitative means maybe the safety standards, the hygiene standards. Quantitative is something which can be measured. So, for example, they may not have accurate data on the percentage of sexual harassment that is there in their organization, or the employees not be trained, injured, or the percentage of grievance mechanism. The grievances that may be lodged in the grievance mechanism. So I think these are quite a few reasons on this topic.
So very important that companies can get both the quantitative and qualitative data, and that they can, those help them identify the risks that they actually have as a business. Transparency is a huge concern, especially with increasing pressures from regulators and consumers, as you've mentioned. How should companies adapt to this new reality? And what happens if they don't?
Well, let's talk of a few measures that businesses should adopt. Companies could adopt and follow the steps. Actually, I would like to start with that businesses should start with due diligence within their own company and their supply chain. Here, businesses could adopt and follow the steps of due diligence by aligning with the United Nations guiding principles. I would look into the operational principles between 16 to 24. I would quickly just summarize it. Of course, it starts with commitment of the top management to embed responsible business conduct in their policies and systems. effective stakeholder engagement, risk assessments of human right impacts, actual and potential, integrating and taking action on risk assessment findings, monitoring and tracking, communicating and reporting. And finally, let's talk about remediation. So we start with due diligence, and the other measures that companies could adopt would be they could upgrade their internal information accountability system, which enables them to get more accurate data. They could use the maturity assessment tool, which is being offered by VECTRA International and Ethisphere. Companies should know various ESG-related processes used in their own operations and supply chain and identify the gaps in them. This will help them to understand what they have to improve, the areas of improvements they will understand. And finally, communication should be easily accessible and understandable to the affected stakeholders. Also, confidentiality is of great importance, commercial as well as the views of affected stakeholders.
Okay, so really working closely with stakeholders and understanding also the UN guiding principles and how they're related to your business, as well as really performing due diligence. Super important. Let's talk about some best practices. Given the rapid changes in regulations, what would be the 5 best practices you've seen companies adopt to stay ahead?
Well, in my experience, India's textile industry is experiencing a shift towards sustainability and technology advancement, which is driven by environmental awareness, regulatory laws, and evolving market demands. So, some of the best practices that companies could adopt would be assess the environmental impact of current garment production in their business. They need to develop sustainable sourcing, which can provide certified and eco-friendly raw materials. Could also choose sustainable raw materials, which ensure traceability in the value chain. Business, employers, and employees should have sufficient knowledge about sustainability initiatives. Majority of the supply chain should incorporate practices by 2030, which would align with the UN Sustainable Developmental Goals. There are 17 SDG goals, so it would be important if the supply chain could align with them.
Great. So the 5 best practices are to assess the environmental impact, to develop sustainable sourcing, to have traceable raw materials, ensure knowledge about sustainable initiatives, and align with the SDG goals. Is that correct?
Yes.
Great. If a company is just getting started with ESG reporting, what's the smartest way for them to begin? What are the first key steps they should take to build a solid foundation?
Well, over here, I would say they have to start with the steps of due diligence, which I mentioned earlier. And then I'd like to talk about how they could further it from there. Now, they need to understand their ESG. Over here, let me talk about business should familiarize themselves with the ESG frameworks, which actually are guidelines that help companies to understand and manage their environmental, social governance impacts. Now, the environmental aspect What does it cover? It basically covers topics such as climate change, waste management, biodiversity, and many more. When we talk about social aspect, I'm just breaking down ESG. So I've spoken about environmental, now I'm talking about social. What does that cover? Because ESG is a big word. So social covers like could be your labor practices. It could also be your occupational health and safety, and various other parameters which involve human rights, risks, and governance. Governance highlights anti-corruption policies, a balanced constitution of the board, risk management strategies, and many more. Now, in India, I'd like to talk a little bit about India. In India, we have the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting. In short, BRSR framework, which is closely aligned with globally accepted reporting frameworks. The top 1,000 companies listed on the stocks exchange are mandated to annually report. There are 9 main parameters, which is environmental protection, human rights, integrity, employee well-being, inclusive growth, sustainable goods and services, responsible consumer engagement, stakeholder engagement, and responsible policy engagement. Now, here I'd like to go on to the next step. Companies should focus on what they want to achieve for their business by ESG reporting and measure the progress. Use the maturity assessments, which is being offered by VECTRA International and Etisphere. Understand your business's current practices. Identify the areas of hidden risk where your company needs improvement. For example, in the occupational health and safety area, or maybe the ethical behavior areas, and many more. Finally, the third step would be to create a strategy where you involve your senior management, your stakeholders, internal and external, and outline your ESG sustainability goals and consequently your reporting goals.
Great. So basically, it's really super important that companies identify their risks, because if they know what their risks are, then they can create a strategy to improve.
Yes, and have a vision.
Yes. And get the buy-in from the stakeholders.
Yes, and the top management, which is very important.
And the top management, which you've mentioned several times, indeed. I include that in the stakeholders, but yes, important to identify that as well. For companies listening today that are struggling with supply chain reporting, where should they start?
As good reporting translates into good ratings, companies need to overcome new challenges of lack of knowledge among their untrained staff, and increasingly, the best starting point will be the maturity assessment being offered by VECTRA International and Etisphere. I'd like to talk more about this. The social and environment maturity assessment can help business to pinpoint hidden risks across complex supply chain, quantify residual risk to prioritize action areas effectively, gain actionable insights to strengthen their supply chain. One of the best things about maturity assessment is that each assessment includes a 45-minute consultation with a world-class expert. In this consultation, the experts breaks down the report, and following the call, you get a personalized action plan for your business.
So indeed, I think the maturity assessments, there's both an environmental one and a social one, that can really help businesses identify their inherent risks, the maturity of their programs, and also their residual risk, so that they really understand where they need to improve as a business. So thank you, Nina, for sharing all of your expertise with us today.
Thank you, Octavia, for having me here. It was a great session and I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
So that concludes our insightful session with Nina. As we've discussed today, reporting isn't just about compliance. It's about building trust, improving accountability, and future-proofing your business. For companies struggling with supply chain reporting, the best place to start is with a maturity assessment. At VECTRA International, we help companies identify gaps, quantify risks, and build reporting systems that hold up under scrutiny. If you're looking to strengthen your due diligence and reporting processes, you can reach out to us. If you found this podcast helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your network. We're doing a podcast every month with an industry expert for useful insights and practical strategies related to supply chain risks. So I'll see you in the next one. Thank you, take care, and bye-bye.